Heather's video should be spotlighted. Is there any difference now for folks? Oh, we got it. Okay.
Yes.
Great.
We're good.
Thanks, everyone. The new technology, getting used to it still. So we'll try one more time. So basically, we have 30 worm bins behind the scenes here. And managing that many bins, we do get issues from time to time. So I'm going to show you examples of good bins and examples of things that go wrong and what we do to fix them. So the number one thing to monitor in your bin is the moisture level. You want your bins to be about the moisture of a wrung out sponge. So you don't want it to be too dry and you don't want it to be too wet. So this bin that I have here is a good example of what it should look like. The newspaper, it's not sopping wet. It's just a little bit moist. That kind of sits on top lightly. So if you don't have bedding on your compost bin inside, you should have a little layer of bedding. And then the texture of the compost itself, it's not too wet, it's pretty crumbly, and it's not too dry. So this is a good example of what it should look like. So if your bins get too dry, that is a problem for two reasons. One, we want to have these aerobic bacteria that live in our bins really active because they really help break down the food. And when it gets too dry, that can kind of kill off those bacteria. So we don't want to do that because worms, they don't have teeth. So the bacteria help break down that food so that they're actually able to access it and eat it. And then the other thing is when your bin gets too dry, the worms can actually asphyxiate because they kind of breathe, for lack of a better word, through their skin. And they need this moisture to make this mucousy layer that helps them do that. So if your bin's too dry, your worms aren't going to be able to move well. They're not going to be able to breathe well. So worms bins being too dry isn't a very common problem, but it can happen, especially like in the winter when we're all putting on our heating systems and the air in our homes can get a little dry. So definitely monitor that. I used to have a bin in like a pantry that could be there all summer. It was great, but in the winter, that room got too hot, too dry, and so I had to move my worms out. So always be monitoring. If they get too dry, the best thing to do is just have a spray bottle and you can just kind of spritz your bin. And you can also just make sure that your newspaper layer is really moist and is kind of covering the bin to help keep that moisture in. I've seen sometimes folks, they'll shred the newspaper and put it in like a little bucket and then pour water in and make sure the newspaper gets really wet, and then you can kind of wring it out and then spread it over on top. But most of the time, this is not a huge issue, but just wanted to mention it. If anyone has questions about dry bins, feel free to throw it in the chat. Now, bins being too wet is by far the biggest problem that we have here. So this bin, about a week ago, I came and it had some like pooled water in it. And you can see, well, I hope you can see, it's still a little bit too wet here. This is not the consistency we want for our compost. So this happens for a couple of reasons. One, maybe you're just like feeding your worms too much food and they're not able to like eat enough. But it also will happen even if you're managing your bins well, because we're feeding worms things like fruits and vegetable scraps that have really high water content. So over time, that moisture can kind of just build up. So if it happens to you, you're not doing anything wrong necessarily, just it happens sometimes. So to fix, yeah.
Kristen, we've got a comment and question from Kathy. Kathy says that they've got shredded newspaper throughout their bin contents, not just on top. Are we supposed to only have the paper on top?
That's a really great question. So you can mix it in. We choose not to here just because it really helps with harvesting. I don't know if you've harvested your bins yet, but if you're trying to get out the compost and there's all these newspaper scraps mixed in, it just makes it really difficult. So we like to not mix it in if possible, but you can do it. There's nothing wrong with doing it, but just thinking ahead for harvesting, I prefer not to. Great question though.
Thank you.
So yeah. So if your bin is too wet, there's a couple of things that you can do. First, if you come and there's like a pool of water in your bin, go ahead and just pour that off. We don't, you know, I used to try to like make it better with lots and lots of dry newspaper, but if you see a pool of water, just pour it off. You don't need it. Let's get rid of it. Just make sure you don't throw any worms out along the way doing that. Carefully remove the excess liquid. And then you can try to feed foods that have like a lower water content for a little while. So, you know, instead of feeding like cucumbers and tomatoes and melon, maybe try to stick to things like carrots. That's the only thing coming to mind right now, but foods that aren't as water heavy. And then you can always add more shredded newspaper. If you have it, mass shredded newspaper for 30 worm bins at a time. Sometimes we have like a little like kiddie pool set up and we just shred newspaper into it. So we have enough for all of our bins. But you basically just find a little notch in the top of your newspaper fold and pull down, and it should pull out into these perfect little strips. So you can just get some strips of newspaper and just add them straight to the bin, fluff them up. You want to make sure you're not, you know, not like you're blocking airflow or anything. So you want to make sure your strips are fluffy. I added a few strips in here last week to try to soak up the water. You can see this is one that I added. Like it really does soak up the excess fluids a lot. So this really helps. And then what was the other thing I wanted to tell you about? Oh, you can also mix, I've never done this, but I have read that some folks like to mix in like dry coconut coir, and you can just mix that in, and that dry coconut coir will help absorb some of the excess water as well.
Thanks, Kristen. We've got another question from Isabel. They're asking about types of paper, if it's okay to use thicker than newspaper type paper, and does it matter if it's got ink on it?
That's a great question. And I'm guessing this might be a volunteer, Isabel. So if it is, hi. So I don't know about the thickness of the paper. You wouldn't want it to be so thick that it's gonna like weigh down on the bins. Sometimes I find like my newspaper is like too weighed into the compost, and we don't want that because we want airflow. So I think you could give it a shot. And if you find that it's like compacting your bin too much, maybe take it out. And then with ink, basically newspapers are okay because it's like a soy-based ink, but you don't want to use anything that you wouldn't want your worms to eat, I guess, or come into contact with.
Awesome, thank you. And Isabel confirmed, yes, it is. It is
nice to virtually see you, Isabel. So why don't you want your worm bin to be wet? There are two big reasons. One, well, actually, there's a couple of reasons. One, it can just make it smell bad. And that's because the anaerobic bacteria start to really take off in a system like that. And we don't really want those bacteria. They just smell really bad, and we don't want to encourage that in our bins. And the other thing is when your bins get really wet, it just kind of like compacts everything, and it reduces like the available oxygen to your worms, which they need to live. So we just don't want our bins to get too wet and stinky and make our worms not happy. So does anyone else have any more wet worm bin questions? Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is, I kind of just touched on it, but yeah.
We actually do have a question from Carolyn. If you could expand a little bit on aerobic and anaerobic bacteria a little bit. And they also asked
Yes.
if you could define stinky for us, which
I'll
is a
do
good
my
question
best.
because
That is a good
yeah.
question. That's a great question. Stinky. Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. So, like, worm bins are gonna have like an earthy smell to them, but they shouldn't smell. You shouldn't like want to immediately remove your face away from them. Is that a good definition of stinky? Um, they'll smell earthy, but you don't want them to smell like rotting food or that smell. And then I'm guessing this is maybe volunteer Carolyn. Also a great question. So that we've got our aerobic bacteria and our anaerobic bacteria. Um, Anaerobic bacteria love to be in environments like without oxygen, and aerobic bacteria want to be in environments with oxygen. This is not like a super scientific explanation, just a short explanation, we'll say. So when our bins are really wet and like compacted, the anaerobic bacteria are going to start multiplying. And these bacteria, like they emit those like kind of almost like sulfur smells. And that's what makes things smell really bad in your bin. Whereas the aerobic bacteria, when they're breaking down things, they don't smell bad and they just help us like help the food be more available to the worms. Carolyn might know more about this than I, but I do think there's also something about like the types of gases that are released with aerobic versus anaerobic. Like anaerobic is like more greenhouse gases than aerobic, but I'd want to fact check myself on that one. But hopefully that answers those questions. Also, if it's volunteer Carolyn, hi.
I believe it is.
So, smelly bins. So like I was just saying, if your bin is too wet, those anaerobic bacteria are going to start making your bin stink, which is not pleasant. But it's also possible that your bin is smelling because there's too much food in it, which it could be that maybe you're feeding your worms too much. So maybe you're feeding them once a week and they're just not eating as much as you're giving them. So you can try cutting back the food a little bit and see if that helps. It might not. If it doesn't, it's possible that you're just feeding them things that they don't want to eat. So worms, they have this like very delicate skin that they breathe out of. And the way I've had it explained to me, which I think is helpful, is you don't want to feed your worms anything that you wouldn't want to put on your eyelid. So like a spicy pepper, that wouldn't feel good if you put that on your eyelid. So that's like a good test. Generally, you don't want to put anything spicy or anything too acidic. Citrus, we try not to put in our bins. The worms just don't really like it. And so it might just pile up in your bin and start to smell. So those are good ways to prevent your bin from getting too smelly, which, yeah, I need to come up with like a good definition of what smelly means, but just an odor that you don't want in your home, rather. The other thing is you might want to make sure if your bin is smelly and wet that it's getting enough airflow. So hopefully you can see this on here. We have these holes drilled all along the side of our bins. If you don't have holes, you should definitely make some holes because the worms need air to breathe and live. And maybe you just don't have enough and there's not enough air being able to get in. So you could try drilling some extra holes too and see if that helps as well. Sound good? All right. Does anyone have any more questions about smelly bins, wet bins, dry bins?
We do have some questions.
Okay.
Someone asked, what do you recommend if you have more compost materials than the worms can eat?
That's a great question. Because yeah, I definitely consume more, like have more food waste than I could ever feed worm bins at my house.
Right.
Like it's hard because they can eat a lot for their body weight, but they're pretty tiny. So that's not that much. So a couple of things. If you have access to an outdoor space, outdoor composting is amazing, and you can really do a lot with that. But I know I don't, and most people in Chicago don't have access to build a compost bin. So personally, I use a composting pickup service. So I have like my bin of stuff for my worms, and then I have a bucket then in our house, and they just come pick it up every 2 weeks. And those are actually great too, to kind of complement your worm bins, because the industrial composting can take a lot more things than your worm bin can. Like you can put bread and dairy and like things with oil and meat. You can put that all in an industrial compost bin, whereas you can't put that in your worm bin. So there's a couple of different companies in Chicago that do that. Like there's like Urban Canopy, Collective Resource, Healthy Soils. I don't know, Sarah, if you can think of any other ones, but they basically just drop off a bin at your house, and then they come pick it up 2 weeks later and then give you a new bin. So that's a good way to do it.
Thank you. Somebody also
Yeah.
asked about the best place to store the bin in your home.
Great question. So that might change like throughout the year based on your house. So worms, generally, if like you're comfortable temperature wise, they're comfortable. So they don't like anything colder than 60 degrees and nothing hotter than 80 degrees. So maybe like spring and fall, if you have a garage, they could go in your garage or your basement. But in the summer and winter, you got to monitor a little bit more to make sure they don't get too cold or too hot. I used to keep mine under my kitchen table because if you're, managing it well, it shouldn't smell, and it's a convenient place to put it. But obviously, not everyone wants a bucket of worms in their kitchen. I also kept mine in like a pantry. Anywhere that it's not going to be like too dry, too hot, or too cold. I hope that answers your question.
Awesome. Yeah, that was great. We've got another question from Nate.
Yeah.
Nate asked about little round red bugs in the bin.
Little round red bugs. Well, I don't know, but if you want to take a picture of the bug and send it to me, we can try to figure it out. My email address is and anyone, if you have any composting questions after this, feel free to send me emails. My email address is just volunteering@garfieldpark.org. So yeah, maybe send me a picture of that bug and we can try to figure that out.
Can you talk a little bit more about the bugs that you're familiar with seeing in the bin, and whether those are good or bad?
Definitely. Yeah, that's actually the next thing I wanted to talk about. So great transition. I don't know that you'll be able to see it on camera, but you do find other bugs in your bins from time to time, including we get a lot of like, oh man, I don't know if you'll be able to see it. Maybe in this bin. Let's see. So you might be able to see, I'm not sure how good the camera quality is, these like white mites kind of running around. Those are totally fine. They don't hurt anything or do anything wrong. So they just live in there. From time to time, I do find a spider in a bin. If you find a spider, definitely remove it from your bin. Maybe put it in a cup, bring it outside. The other things to look out for in your bin are centipedes. If you find a centipede in your bin, you want to remove it because they are carnivorous. If you find millipedes in your bins, those are okay. You can leave them in there. So centipedes, I always think of them as like centipedes are the ones that their legs are like sticking out the sides, and millipedes, their legs are more tucked under, if that makes sense. So yeah, centipedes, spiders, take them out of your bin. Millipedes and mites, they're okay in your bin. Fruit flies can be an issue. I don't mind so much here having fruit flies because we just have these bins on like some shelves in the back. So, fruit flies don't bother us as much, but in your house, you might just not want them. They don't do anything wrong, but you probably just don't want to be like breeding fruit flies in your home. So one way that you can prevent that is always freezing your food scraps before you feed them to your worms to help kill off those fruit fly eggs, especially things like banana peels, I guess, are notorious for having like lots of fruit fly eggs on them. So what I do is I keep a canister in my freezer, and I, like, if I'm like chopping celery or something and I have a little bit left, I'll chop it up and just put it in that bin. It's always easier, I found many times, to chop the food before you freeze it rather than like freezing a whole rotten apple and then trying to chop it up when it's frozen, because that's incredibly frustrating. So just my tip would be for fruit flies, chop your food up, freeze it, and then feed it. I usually thaw it out in the fridge just so it's not too shocking to the worms. But I don't know how necessary that is. I feel like they like it. Are there any other bug questions? Sorry, I don't know what that red bug is.
We not about bugs, but we do have another question. Chelsea asks if the worms eat less in winter. And then we also had a question about how many worms is too many worms in a bin?
Good questions. I have not found that they eat less in the winter because I don't think they really know what's going on. You know, they just live in this bin that's in a climate controlled area all year round. So I think I've never noticed a difference, but if you do, that would be interesting to learn more about. Yeah, but and these worms, important to talk about, I guess, is red wiggler worms, which is what we use for vermicomposting. They are not native to this area. So you definitely never want to put them outside and throw them in your garden because they're not native and we don't want to introduce them to the area. So I don't know how they experience winter, but I've not noticed a difference. Can you remind me what the other question was, Sarah?
How many worms is too many worms?
Yeah. You know, so I've heard so many different things about this. Someone once told me that the worms somehow like regulate themselves, like they can sense the space, but I've never found anything that really supports that. So I don't know how it works, honestly, but they seem to fill the space and not get too out of control. In a bin like this, you might want like about a pound of worms, and that'll help eat about a pound of food scraps every couple of days. But I really don't know how they can sense their space is what their space is, but that's what I've been told. So I don't really have a good answer for that. Yeah. But if you find sorry, that's a horrible answer. But if you find that your bin is like you're just sensing like, oh my God, there's too many worms here, like you can always divide it and, you know, really create like a worm bin tower in your house. Maybe give them to some friends. Yeah.
Thanks, Kristen. We also had it was kind of a two-part question with Chelsea here. They say that they've wrapped their bin in burlap and straw for insulation before during the winter. And they're going to try putting their bin right outside their door outside this year. Would you advise that? Is that okay?
You know, I've never heard of doing that. I would worry. Well, I guess it just depends on like how much straw we're talking about. You really don't want them to get too cold. Like I was saying, they don't really like anything below 60. So I probably wouldn't do it. That being said, I do know someone that left a worm bin out during the winter, and in the spring, some worms were still alive. So if that's like a risk you want to take, it might work, but I probably wouldn't personally do it because it can get so cold. But yeah, I'd be curious to see your setup and how you insulate it. That's a cool idea. We here, so like we have like a bunch of shelves in the back that we just kind of stack them on. So obviously it's a lot easier here to find a space for bins than in your house. So I haven't had to deal with that issue personally.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
That's the last one for now.
Okay, cool. So I guess lastly, I'll talk about runaway worms. Earlier, there were some kind of happening in this bin, but with the light, they've gone back down into the bin. So I don't know if you've ever like opened up your worm bin and like all the worms are crawling up the side or like on the edge of the lid and they're acting like they're trying to escape. So that's just a pretty good sign that your worms are not happy. Something is wrong in your bin. So it could be that, you know, any of the things we talked about already, like it's too dry, it's too wet. It could be the temperature, like we were just saying, if it gets too cold or too hot, they might be trying to get out of your bins. Another reason they might try to do it is if the environment has become too acidic. So if you've been feeding your worms like only tomatoes for 2 months or, you know, really acidic foods, it's going to create an acidic environment in your bins and your worms aren't going to really like that. So maybe try switching to some less acidic foods. And that's kind of a good thing in general when you're feeding your worms. Try to give them a little variety so we're not making it too acidic or anything like that. The other thing is it just might be time to harvest your bins. So basically, after, depending on how much you feed and how many worms you have, after a while, this compost is really going to build up and it can kind of make an acidic environment. So you do need to harvest your bins from time to time. I'm notoriously like horrible at harvesting enough here because it takes a long time, but it is a really important thing to do to keep things going in your bin and keep all of your levels maintained. So do we have time to talk about the 2 ways of harvesting?
It's 11:32.
Oh my God, I thought it was gonna be like 11:15.
I know, yeah, time went by really quickly.
Okay, wow. Well, I guess that's a good plug then. If maybe you're not composting yet and you want to compost, at the end of next month, I think it's November 21st, we're going to be doing an online virtual worm composting class. We'll go into everything in like way more details, talk about harvesting methods, talk more about worm anatomy, because they're pretty neat creatures. And then we'll actually be doing building a bin together virtually. There'll be an option to purchase materials from us to pick up and build the bin with us with the worms. So if you're interested in that, you can find it on our calendar. Maybe, is there like one question or anything that we could do real quick before we cut out, or it is time?
No more questions.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining. I hope you learned something and good luck worm composting.
Thanks, Kristen.
Thanks, everyone.